September 13th, 1946. Třešť, Czechoslovakia. A 23-year-old woman named Herta Kasparova is being dragged toward a wooden pole erected near the town castle. She's screaming. Her legs have given out beneath her. Two guards hold her upright as she stares at the execution device, a simple vertical post with a noose hanging from the top. She collapses completely, her body going limp with terror, and the guards have to physically lift her to her feet. Witnesses will later report that urine runs down her legs, pooling in the dirt beneath her. This is the woman who just months earlier walked through this same town, calmly pointing at her neighbors, and with a snap of her fingers sent them to their deaths. Now it's her turn. And the method of execution chosen for her, pole hanging, is reserved for the most hated traitors in Czechoslovak history. It's designed not for quick death, but for prolonged suffering. And what this 23-year-old woman did to earn such a fate will shock you far more than the brutal execution itself. Before we descend into this dark chapter, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. We uncover the most disturbing truths that history buried. Trust me, what's coming next will change how you see betrayal, revenge, and justice forever. June 21st, 1923. A baby girl is born in the railway station building in Třešť, a small town in the Bohemian Moravian highlands of what was then Czechoslovakia. Her parents name her Herta Kasparova, though the spelling of their surname would shift between Kasper and Kasper throughout the years, an opportunistic flexibility that would define this family. Her father, Alois, works as a railway dispatcher for the Czechoslovak State Railways. He's been transferred to Třešť shortly before Herta's birth. The family is Sudeten-German, ethnic Germans from the Šumperk region, living in a predominantly Czech town. And from the moment Herta enters the world, she carries a burden that will shape everything that comes after. She's born with a deformed right leg. The defect causes her to walk with a pronounced limp, dragging her twisted foot with every step. Picture growing up in a small town in the 1920s and 1930s with a visible disability. Třešť had fewer than 3,000 residents. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone noticed the German girl with the limp. Herta attended the local elementary school. She joined the Sokol Youth Organization, a Czech nationalist gymnastics group that promoted physical fitness and Czech cultural identity. She had Czech friends. She spoke both Czech and German fluently, but she was different, and children can be monstrously cruel to difference. Former classmates would later testify that Herta was relentlessly mocked for her limp. Boys imitated her dragging walk. Girls whispered and laughed when she passed. The taunting was constant, vicious, and left deep psychological scars on a girl who already felt marked as other, already felt like she didn't quite belong. Her family didn't help. The Kaspers had a reputation in Třešť for opportunism. Despite living in Czechoslovakia and Alois working for the Czechoslovak Railways, the family spoke German at home and identified as German. But after the Munich Agreement in 1938, when it looked like they might be expected to relocate to Nazi Germany, they suddenly claimed Czech ancestry. Herta's father switched the spelling of their surname, trying to make it sound more Czech. They wanted the benefits of being German without the consequences. The town noticed, and the resentment built. Then in March 1939, everything changed. Adolf Hitler, having already annexed the Sudetenland, now seized the rest of Czechoslovakia. On March 15th, German troops marched into Prague. The independent Czechoslovak state ceased to exist. In its place, the Nazis created the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, a puppet state under German control. For ethnic Germans living in Czech-majority areas, this was their moment. Suddenly, speaking German wasn't a liability, it was an advantage. Suddenly, the people who'd been a minority were now backed by the full power of the Nazi Reich. And for Herta Kasparova, now 16 years old, this occupation would offer something she'd never had before: power over the people who'd mocked her. But wait until you hear what she did with that power, because what comes next will reveal how personal resentment, combined with systematic evil, creates monsters. The Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia was brutal by design. Reichsprotector Reinhard Heydrich, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, had a clear objective: wipe out Czech culture entirely and make the protectorate indistinguishable from Germany. Czech universities were closed. Czech intellectuals were arrested or executed. The Czech language was suppressed in favor of German. And to implement this cultural genocide, the Nazis needed collaborators. They needed Czechs or ethnic Germans living among Czechs who could identify resistance members, translate interrogations, and help root out anyone who opposed German rule. Sudeten Germans were perfect for this role. They spoke both languages. They knew the local populations, and many of them harbored resentments against their Czech neighbors. Around 1940, Herta Kasparova, now 17 years old, began working for the German criminal police in Jihlava, a city about 30 kilometers from Třešť. Her job title was clerk and translator. Her actual role was far darker. She worked in interrogations. When Czech resistance members or suspected dissidents were brought in for questioning, Herta translated. She sat there as Gestapo officers tortured prisoners for information. She listened to screams and pleas in Czech, then calmly translated them into German for her bosses. She witnessed the full machinery of Nazi terror, the beatings, the psychological torture, the casual brutality inflicted on people whose only crime was wanting their country back. And instead of being horrified, instead of finding ways to help her countrymen, Herta thrived. In September 1942, she was promoted and transferred to Zlín, the headquarters of the regional criminal police and Gestapo operations. Zlín was a larger city, home to the famous Bata shoe company, which had been seized by the Nazis and converted to war production. The Gestapo office there handled more serious cases, high-level resistance members, organized underground networks, people who posed real threats to German occupation. Herta Kasparova was now at the center of the Nazi security apparatus in Moravia. Her translations led to arrests. Those arrests led to interrogations. Those interrogations, often conducted with torture, led to confessions that were frequently false, extracted under unbearable pain. And those confessions led to executions. How many people died because of Herta Kasparova's work in Jihlava and Zlín? We'll never know the exact number. Czech sources suggest her denunciations and translations were responsible for numerous deaths. Some estimates put it at 20 or more, even before we get to her final, most infamous crime. But here's what made Herta different from other collaborators. Many people who worked for the Germans did so out of fear, trying to survive an impossible situation. Others were true believers in Nazi ideology. Herta Kasparova was motivated by something more personal and more petty: revenge. She remembered every slight, every cruel comment about her limp, every moment of childhood mockery. And now she had the power to settle those scores. But as brutal as her work in Jihlava and Zlín was, it pales in comparison to what she did in May 1945. Because what happened in those final days of the war will explain why her execution was so brutal, why pole hanging was chosen, why thousands of people gathered to watch her die. May 5th, 1945. Nazi Germany is collapsing. Adolf Hitler has been dead for 5 days, having committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30th. Soviet forces are sweeping through Czechoslovakia from the east. American forces are advancing from the west. The war is effectively over. Everyone knows it. And in Prague, the Czech resistance launches the Prague uprising, attempting to liberate their capital before the Soviets arrive. The uprising spreads quickly through the protectorate. In towns and villages across Bohemia and Moravia, Czechs rise up against their German occupiers. Třešť is no exception. On May 5th and 6th, Czech resistance members in Třešť overwhelmed the small German garrison. They hoist Czechoslovak flags, decades of German banners that had flown over their town. They freed Czech prisoners who'd been held by the Germans. And they turn their rage on the collaborators. German officials flee. But ethnic Germans who'd worked with the occupation, they had nowhere to go. Herta Kasparova's family home, the house by the railway station where she'd grown up, is ransacked by angry Czechs. Furniture is destroyed. Windows are smashed. The family's possessions are looted. For those brief 48 hours, it looked like the nightmare was over. Trest was free. The Germans were gone. Justice would come for the collaborators. But liberation was premature. Because on May 7th, 1945, everything changed again. German military forces, primarily SS units, mounted a counteroffensive from Jihlava. It was one of the last successful German military operations of the entire war, a desperate attempt to rescue German nationals and punish the Czech uprising. Armored personnel carriers and military trucks rolled into Třešť. The SS retook control, and they were in no mood for mercy. The uprising had humiliated them. Czech civilians had dared to celebrate their defeat. That couldn't stand. There had to be reprisals. There had to be executions. But the SS troops weren't from Třešť. They didn't know who had participated in the uprising, who had ransacked German homes, who the resistance leaders were. They needed someone local, someone who spoke Czech and German, someone who knew exactly who to blame. They found Herta Kasparova, and they gave her power that would damn her forever. May 7th, 1945. SS soldiers are rounding up Czech men in Třešť, anyone suspected of participating in the uprising, anyone who might have information, anyone the Germans think needs to be punished. They're being held in the town square and in the courtyard of the town hall. Some are resistance members, others are just ordinary citizens who celebrated too publicly when they thought liberation had come. A barber, a railway worker, a janitor. Men with families, men with no involvement in anything political, men whose only crime was being Czech in a town the SS wanted to terrorize. The Germans need to decide who lives and who dies, and they invite Herta Kasparova to make the selection. She climbs into an open car with SS officers. They drive slowly through Třešť, past the detained men, and Herta looks at them, these men she's known her entire life, men from her hometown, and she starts pointing. Him, that one, and him. No words, no explanations, just a finger pointing, sometimes a snap of her fingers, a casual gesture that seals a man's fate. The SS soldiers pull the selected men out of the group and line them up. Witnesses later testified that Herta pointed out 33 people, 33 neighbors, 33 men who would be dead within hours. The executions happened the same day, right there in Třešť. The victims were forced to roll up their shirts. SS soldiers aimed directly at their hearts. Firing squad executions, one after another. Blood soaking into the courtyard cobblestones. Bodies crumpling, the sound of gunfire echoing through a town that had briefly dared to hope for freedom. Among the dead were at least 2 young men who had tormented Herta about her limp when they were children. This is documented in multiple sources. These weren't resistance leaders. These weren't dangerous insurgents. These were men whose primary crime was mocking a disabled girl 20 years earlier in elementary school. And now they were dead because Herta Kasparova never forgot, never forgave, and finally had the power to make them pay. But here's what's truly chilling. After the executions, as bodies lay cooling in the May sunlight, Herta didn't show remorse. Survivors reported that she seemed satisfied. She'd settled her scores. The people who'd made her childhood miserable were dead. The people who'd ransacked her family's home were dead. In her mind, justice had been done. She didn't grasp that she'd just committed mass murder. She didn't understand that what she'd done was unforgivable. She thought the SS would protect her. She thought Germany would still win, or at least that she'd be safe under German protection. She was catastrophically wrong. Within hours, Soviet forces arrived in Třešť. The SS units that had retaken the town withdrew. The war was truly over now. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945, and Herta Kasparova realized she was in mortal danger. Czech witnesses had seen everything. They knew she'd pointed out those men. They knew about her work with the Gestapo in Jihlava and Zlín. They knew she was responsible for Czech deaths throughout the war. If she stayed in Třešť, she would face justice. So she ran. Herta fled to Austria, slipping across the border in the chaos of the war's end. She probably thought she could disappear, become nobody, fade into the mass of displaced persons flooding through Central Europe. Maybe she thought she could start over somewhere else, where nobody knew what she'd done. But you can't run from what happened in a small town where everyone knew everyone. The survivors talked. The witnesses gave statements. The new Czech authorities opened an investigation. And in 1946, Czech police found her. They arrested her in Austria and brought her back to Třešť to face trial. back to the scene of her crimes, back to the town where she'd sent 33 men to their deaths. But the trial and the execution, what happened next, will be burned into Czech memory forever. The exact date of Herta Kasparova's trial isn't extensively documented in English sources, but it happened sometime in the summer or early fall of 1946. It was held before a people's court, the special tribunals established by Czechoslovakia to prosecute collaborators in war criminals. These weren't show trials. They followed legal procedures. Witnesses testified, evidence was presented. The accused had the right to speak, and Herta Kasparova did speak. What she said shocked everyone in the courtroom. "I know that I caused the death of several people. I acted out of revenge." Revenge, not following orders, not coerced by the Germans, not trying to survive an impossible situation. Revenge. She admitted it openly. She'd sent people to their deaths because she wanted revenge for childhood bullying, for her family's home being ransacked, for every perceived slight against her. The judges heard testimony from witnesses who'd survived the May 7th massacre. They heard about Herta's work with the Gestapo. They heard about the interrogations, the denunciations, the deaths that flowed from her translations and her betrayals. The evidence was overwhelming, and the verdict was never in doubt. Guilty of collaboration, guilty of crimes against humanity, guilty of causing the deaths of Czech citizens. Sentence: death by hanging. But not just hanging, pole hanging, the traditional method used in Czechoslovakia for executing traitors. A method specifically designed to be slower, more painful, more humiliating than standard hanging. A method that would ensure Herta Kasparova suffered before she died, just as her victims had suffered. The sentence was to be carried out immediately. No lengthy appeals process, no chance for clemency. Justice would be swift. September 13th, 1946, the afternoon. A large crowd gathers near Třešť Castle. This isn't a secret execution behind prison walls. This is public. Herta Kasparova will die in front of her former neighbors, in front of the families of the men she murdered, in front of anyone who wants to witness justice being done. The execution device stands ready, a stout, vertical wooden pole approximately 3 meters tall, about 60 centimeters wide, and 5 centimeters thick. It's been specially constructed for this execution. At the top is a metal hook or pulley. The condemned will be tied to the pole, a noose placed around the neck, and then the platform beneath removed. But unlike standard hanging, where the drop breaks the neck and causes near-instant death, pole hanging is designed to strangle slowly. The condemned's weight pulls on the noose, gradually cutting off air, the process taking 10 to 20 minutes of conscious suffering. Guards bring Herta out. She's wearing a simple dress. Her hands are bound. And when she sees the pole for the first time, her legs give out completely. She collapses to the ground, screaming, terror overwhelming her. The guards have to physically lift her and drag her toward the execution site. Witnesses later report that she's visibly shaking, crying, begging. This is the same woman who calmly pointed out men to be executed 15 months earlier. Now she's facing the consequence, and the arrogance has evaporated. She's just a terrified 23-year-old who finally understands what she's done and what's about to happen to her. A Catholic priest approaches and offers final blessings. Herta takes them, desperately clinging to any comfort in her final moments. The guards tie her to the pole with ropes, securing her body so she won't collapse when the platform drops. They place a noose around her neck, positioning it carefully. The rope is attached to the hook at the top of the pole. An executioner stands behind the pole, ready to pull the rope tight. An assistant stands ready to push up on Herta's head, using her own body weight against her to tighten the noose and speed the strangulation. The platform beneath her feet is small, barely large enough to stand on. Witnesses notice the puddle of urine forming at the base of the pole. Herta has lost control of her bladder from sheer terror. She's sobbing, her whole body shaking. Then the platform drops. Herta's full weight falls onto the noose. The rope tightens around her neck, cutting into flesh. Her body instinctively fights for air, legs kicking at nothing, hands bound and useless, unable to reach the rope that's strangling her. The executioner behind the pole pulls the rope tighter. The assistant pushes up on her head, using leverage to increase the pressure on her throat. This isn't the quick snap of a proper hanging. This is slow asphyxiation. Her face turns red, then purple as blood flow to her brain is restricted. Her eyes bulge. Her mouth opens, gasping for air that can't reach her lungs. The crowd watches in silence. Some are satisfied, seeing justice done for murdered loved ones. Others are disturbed by the brutality of it, but nobody looks away. Contemporary accounts describe pole hanging as one of the worst execution methods in European history because of the prolonged consciousness. Unlike a proper long drop hanging where the neck breaks instantly, pole hanging victims remain aware for minutes as they slowly strangle. They feel everything, the crushing pressure on their throat, the desperate need for air, the growing darkness as their brain is starved of oxygen, the sheer terror of knowing death is coming but not being able to do anything about it. For Herta Kasparova, those minutes must have felt like hours. Her body convulses, an involuntary response to oxygen deprivation. Her struggles grow weaker as her strength fades. But she's still conscious, still aware, still suffering. The crowd watches her die slowly, minute by agonizing minute. Finally, mercifully, she stops moving. Her body hangs limp on the pole. A doctor approaches to check for a pulse. He confirms, Herta Kasparova is dead. The time is recorded as 6:38 p.m. She was 23 years old, the same age as many of the young men she'd sent to their deaths. Her body is cut down and placed in a wooden box that will serve as her coffin. Photographs document every stage of the execution. The terrified woman being tied to the pole, the moment of death, the body being checked by doctors, the corpse being removed. These photographs still exist, circulating on historical websites and forums, preserved as evidence of what happened when a nation sought justice for collaboration and betrayal. Herta Kasparova's execution was the last public execution of a woman in Czechoslovak history. The brutality of it, the public nature of it, seemed to mark the end of an era. After her, executions would be conducted behind prison walls, away from public view. But at that moment in 1946, with wounds still fresh, with families still mourning murdered loved ones, the Czech people wanted their justice public. They wanted collaborators to know there would be consequences. They wanted everyone to see what happened to traitors. But here's the question that still haunts historians. Was this justice or revenge? Herta Kasparova was guilty. There's no dispute about that. She worked for the Gestapo. She translated interrogations that led to arrests and deaths. She pointed out 33 men to be executed in May 1945. She admitted to acting out of revenge. She deserved punishment. But did she deserve to be strangled slowly in front of a crowd? Did the brutality of her execution make the Czech people any better than the Nazis they'd suffered under? This is the moral complexity of post-war justice in Eastern Europe. Thousands of collaborators were executed in Czechoslovakia, Poland, Yugoslavia, and other liberated countries. Some got quick trials and quick executions. Others, like Herta, got public spectacles designed to send a message. The message was, collaboration has consequences. Betraying your countrymen to occupiers will cost you your life. But the method, especially pole hanging, seemed designed not just to execute, but to torture. And that raises uncomfortable questions about whether justice should ever involve deliberate infliction of suffering. Compare Herta Kasparova's fate to that of other collaborators. Karl Hermann Frank, who'd been Heydrich's deputy and played a major role in the Lidice massacre, where an entire Czech village was destroyed in retaliation for Heydrich's assassination, was also pole-hanged in Prague in May 1946. His execution was filmed, and the footage shows how the method worked, how brutal it was. Frank was one of the architects of Czech suffering, responsible for thousands of deaths. His pole hanging seemed proportionate to his crimes. But Herta Kasparova, yes, she caused deaths. Yes, she collaborated with evil. But was she in the same category as Frank? Or was her execution partially motivated by the fact that she was a traitor from within, an ethnic German who'd lived among Czechs, learned their language, befriended them, and then turned on them? Betrayal by one of your own cuts deeper than oppression by a foreign occupier. The families of her victims certainly thought her execution was justified. One survivor, whose father was killed on Herta's orders, stated years later that watching her die brought closure. He'd seen his father selected by Herta's pointing finger, seen him shot in the heart, mourned for 15 months wondering if anyone would pay for that crime. Watching Herta hanged, knowing she'd faced consequences, helped him move forward. For people who'd lost loved ones to her denunciations, her execution wasn't revenge. It was justice. It was proof that even in the chaos of war's end, the innocent dead mattered enough that their killer wouldn't escape. But there's another side to this story that deserves examination. Herta Kasparova didn't become a monster in a vacuum. She was created by circumstances, by the cruelty of children who mocked her disability, by a family that taught opportunism over principle, by the Nazi occupation that gave her power over people who'd marginalized her, by a system that encouraged betrayal and rewarded denunciation. None of this excuses what she did. None of it makes her less culpable. But it explains how an ordinary person with a disability and a grudge became a killer responsible for dozens of deaths. This is the lesson Třešť teaches us. Evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it grows slowly in the hearts of people who feel wronged, who nurse grievances, who are given power without accountability. Herta wasn't born a monster. She was born a girl with a medical condition into a mixed family in a complicated time. The monster was constructed piece by piece, slight by slight, until the occupation gave her the opportunity to unleash years of accumulated rage. And when that opportunity came, she seized it without hesitation or mercy. The tragedy is that her victims weren't even the worst of her tormentors. Many of the 33 men she condemned weren't involved in her childhood bullying. They were just convenient targets, Czechs who'd celebrated liberation too openly, who'd ransacked German homes, who represented the nation that had always made her feel like an outsider. The two who had definitely mocked her limp, their deaths were personal revenge. The others, they died because Herta had power for a brief moment and used it indiscriminately, lashing out at an entire community for her lifetime of perceived wrongs. Today, Trest remembers the events of May 1945. A memorial stands on the spot where the 33 men were executed, honoring them as victims of Nazi terror and collaboration. An allegorical monument was erected to commemorate the suppressed uprising and those who died. But there's no memorial for Herta Kasparova. She's remembered only as a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when personal grievances mix with systematic evil, when revenge masquerades as collaboration, when one person's lifetime of resentment ends with dozens of deaths. The photographs from her execution remain controversial. Some argue they should be banned, that they're too graphic, that displaying them disrespects the dead. Others insist they must be preserved as historical evidence, as proof of what happened, as a reminder that justice in 1946 looked very different from justice today. What's undeniable is their impact. Even 80 years later, those images of a terrified woman being tied to a pole, dying slowly in front of a crowd, they force us to confront uncomfortable truths about punishment, about revenge, about the line between justice and cruelty. If pole hanging seems barbaric to modern sensibilities, that's because it was barbaric. It was designed to be. Czechoslovakia eventually abolished the practice, moving to more humane execution methods before ultimately abolishing the death penalty entirely. But in 1946, in a nation still bleeding from 6 years of brutal occupation, in a town where 33 men had been murdered just 15 months earlier, on the orders of a woman who admitted she acted out of revenge, brutality seemed appropriate. The families of the dead wanted to see suffering. They wanted the person responsible to feel a fraction of what their loved ones felt when SS bullets tore through their hearts, and the state gave them that satisfaction. Was it right? History doesn't provide easy answers. What we can say is that Herta Kasparova's story serves as a warning about the dangers of allowing childhood grievances to fester into lifelong hatred. A warning about what happens when occupying powers give certain people power over their neighbors. A warning about collaboration, about betrayal, about the human capacity for revenge dressed up as duty, and a warning about justice administered in the immediate aftermath of trauma when wounds are fresh and mercy is in short supply. The 33 men who died on May 7, 1945, deserve better. They deserve to see their country liberated, to rebuild their lives, to grow old with their families. Instead, they were murdered in their own town by their own countrywoman working with foreign occupiers who'd oppressed them for 6 years. Herta Kasparova deserved justice. She got it, though whether the form that justice took was appropriate remains debatable. And Třešť deserved peace. It got memory instead, the burden of remembering both the victims and their killer, forever linked in one of the darkest moments of a dark time. What other buried truths from history should we uncover? What lessons must we learn about collaboration, revenge, and justice? Let us know in the comments below, and subscribe for more historical truths that will challenge everything you thought you knew about human nature. Because the real lessons of history aren't comfortable. They're brutal, complex, and absolutely necessary if we want to understand how ordinary people become monsters and how societies respond when the monsters are finally held accountable.